White Cohuadip. I've just greeted all of you in my Secwepemc language, and greeting you and saying hello, everyone. As Kathleen said, my name is Dawn Morrison, and I'm just going to introduce myself in the traditional way of my mother, who I've inherited my Secwepemc ancestry from. I come from a family, my mother, Bernice August, my late grandmother, Edith Sewell, and my late grandfather, Willard August. And that's my Secwepemc ancestry. Secwepemc are the people, the original people who come from the land where the water flows from the highest mountains through the rivers on its way to the ocean. And we inhabit the south central interior plateau of British Columbia in Canada. And like all Indigenous people around the world, or like many Indigenous people around the world, our name tells who we are in relation to the land. And I've been taught, well, I should also say too that my father, I've inherited Irish and Scottish ancestry from my father, who had originally come to North America through my grandparents for reasons related to food security. So I think it's always important for me to introduce myself. The elders tell me that's the way to call the spirits of the ancestors into the room, especially when you might be feeling a little bit nervous. So, but it's important their spirit guides me in my work, and that's what motivates me. Not just from my Secwepemc, my indigenous ancestry, but the cross-cultural, the colonial, understanding the colonial relationships, and how I've kind of inherited that through my Irish and Scottish ancestry as well. I am, as Kathleen said, the coordinator for the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, the chair/coordinator with the BC Food Systems Network in BC. I also coordinate the Comprehensive Community Planning Project for my community at the Nisconluth Indian Band. And I think it's important to say who we are as Indigenous peoples in BC and who we represent and the voice that we carry through the working group. In BC, we have probably the majority of the cultural and biological diversity that exists in Canada. We have 27 nations of Indigenous peoples, very diverse, almost as diverse as the land itself, and we've got 10 major ecoterrains that exist in the province. We've got 8 of the 11 major Aboriginal language groups within BC, within the colonial, and I should say within the colonial boundaries of BC. BC has, for the most part, unceded territory. So the majority of the 27 nations of Indigenous peoples have never surrendered the land or ceded the land. There are some, thank you. So it's a very, very unique situation in terms of modern day politics and modern day treaties that the provincial government is pushing for economic reasons. As you can imagine, we've got a very neoliberal government who's pushing forward that kind of trade agenda, and also influencing what used to be known as peacekeeping treaty measures, and which have now moved to economic measures that are doomed for failure. And so that's a whole other story that I won't get into, but just to give you some context of who we are as Indigenous peoples in BC. The Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty was formed in March 2006. It was through a conversation that we as Indigenous peoples had been bringing to the mainstream food security movement within the network. And after repeatedly saying that as Indigenous peoples, and especially in BC, and I know in the eastern Canada and eastern US, the eastern parts of Turtle Island or North America, there are Indigenous peoples who have traditionally, agriculture has been a big part of their culture. In BC, that's quite a bit different. We have definitely have agricultural techniques and cultivation techniques that have been a part of our culture for thousands of years, but it's primarily hunting, fishing, and gathering. So a lot of our cultivation techniques in the forests and the fields and the waterways can be considered agriculture as well, but we don't really follow that kind of model, modern kind of model of agriculture. So we're continuously pushing that perspective and broadening the discussion in the food security movement to include the hunting, the fishing, and the gathering. So it brings it to a lot larger, kind of broader ecological perspective. So in doing that and recognizing the diversity in BC, there have been the result of our work, the result of bringing that perspective, increasing the awareness of the issues, some of the concerns, some of the strategies that communities are using to maintain and those traditional harvesting strategies. A lot of awareness has been raised, and a lot of communities have been mobilized within their bioregions to raise the awareness and get more organized. So as a result, the Vancouver Island Coastal Communities Indigenous Food Network has formed. They're an amazing group of people who have come together, and Vancouver Island in itself, and I think all islands are very unique and in a lot of cases very strong in the way they mobilize because they are islands and they're kind of limited in their capacity. So we also have the Central Coast Indigenous Food Network, who has been organized, and then we have the Shuswap Regional Food Network, who has, and I really want to, I would like to have everybody put their hands together for the Shuswap Regional Food Network because they've agreed, and it's not just Indigenous focus in this network, but they've agreed to follow and reclaim the boundaries of Secwepemcúlecw, so the land of the Shuswap, the original peoples, the boundaries of our nation to define the food system. So I think that that's really commendable. So it's a really good example of how Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can work together and learn from Indigenous food systems as a model for social learning. Indigenous people food sovereignty has been a living reality for our people for thousands of years. The concept may just have been newly introduced. It's the English language. It's a new concept, but the living reality is very, very much alive and well in our communities. And we've been doing several things to keep that concept a living reality through different conferences. Outreach, we've had several outreach actions funded even through a lot of the health agencies. We've been linking to other networks, and we've been strategically doing that in different forums such as this and other conferences and other organizations. And we also host a website, the indigenousfoodsystems.org. And we're developing that website as a networking tool and a place where we can come together and meet online and develop an online community. And I just want to end with kind of a real quick summary of what food sovereignty, kind of some of the main elements of food sovereignty, the way our elders and our traditional hunters, our fisher people, our youth, the way they've told us, the way they've described what food sovereignty means to us as Indigenous people, and recognizing the diversity. There's many different nations of Indigenous people that really there's no universal definition because it's up to each community to describe for themselves what it means. So with respect to that, I think the first most important element or principle is the sacredness of it, that food is a gift from the Creator. In our language, in my language, it's Tekelt Kukbi. So food sovereignty is more about our responsibility to maintain those relationships to the plants, the animals, food that the plants and the animals that provide us with our food. And it's not something that can be constrained by colonial laws or policies. It's up to us to be maintaining our responsibility. Food sovereignty is about self-determination. It's about being free from the control of the corporately owned globalized food system. It's about being able to make those decisions for ourselves about where we get our food. It's about participation. Yes. So food sovereignty is also about our participation and our responsibility. So it's based on a day-to-day action and being involved in traditional harvesting activities. So on the individual, family, and community levels, we must be participating in it or we become assimilated into the globalized food system. Food sovereignty is also about policy. While we recognize that food sovereignty is ultimately based on policy driven by practice from a community base, it must be happening as a living reality before we talk policy, but we also recognize colonial policies are impacting our ability to harvest our foods. So I'll end with that, and on behalf of the BC Food Systems Network Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, I'm very honored to receive this honorable mention. Cook's Jam, thank you, as they say.